Welcome and thank you. My name is Christoph Hesse. It's great to be here. This is joint work with Maurice Langner and Ralf Klabunde from the University of Bochum and Anton Benz from ZAST Berlin. The goal of this project is to test question under discussion frameworks by means of a QED annotated corpus. QED theories view texts as complex answers to implicit questions, aka QEDs, and the particular text genre we're looking at in this corpus is the genre of car and motorcycle reviews, which poses a unique challenge with their blend of propositional content in the form of technical specifications and expressive content for the evaluative statements. For this poster, we want to focus on using the corpus in two case studies, one on focus structure and the other on non-issue content. Both case studies address this genre's blend of propositional and expressive content. Right? So focus structure speaks to the information structure of propositional content. Non-issue content speaks to expressive content because expressive evaluative content is the prime example of non-issue content. But before we get into that, a little bit more about the corpus. It's a novel corpus we created. It's XML based to represent hierarchical QD discourse trees. It's German texts and it's available on GitHub. See the link here. It's also, to our knowledge, the first attempt to systematically annotate at issue and not at issue content. And the guidelines are based on previous work by De Kuthi, Riester, Bühring, and colleagues, but also extend on them. For instance, we allow for both right and left branching QED trees. Here you can see an example from the corpus where you can see different XML tags to distinguish between background and topic information or context and focused new information. But also you can see this NI tag here. This is not at issue content. In this case, an evaluative, expressive, adjective, massive. Inter-annotator agreement was calculated using Fleiß's kappa and Krippendorff's alpha. We calculated coefficients for focus, topics, and non-at-issue content. The values are comparable to other studies in this field with respect to focus and topic when taking text complexity into consideration. To our knowledge, there aren't any other corpora with non-at-issue annotations, so there's obviously no comparable kappa and alpha values for non-at-issue annotation. We also developed an annotation tool that comes with the corpus. It's called QDA, which allows for simultaneous annotation of QEDs, focus, topic, and at issueness. But also it validates discourse trees and allows calculating inter-annotator agreement. It's also available on GitHub, see the link. It has a graphic UI. It allows for XML import as well as export, so you can re-import files and share them amongst your team. Primary functions are obviously to create QEDs, text segmentation, there's information tagging. It allows for left and right branching QED trees. That's a difference to the QED trees by Riester and colleagues who favor right branching tree structures. QDA allows you to move entire subtrees, and it has a split window view so you can work on a text file and an XML file side by side or quickly compare two discourse trees, for instance. For this poster, we are looking at two case studies which show the capabilities of this corpus. And like I said, the text genre of vehicle reviews we are looking at has this blend of propositional content and expressive content. So the things we're looking at are focus and not at issue content. Right? Focus structure is more associated with the propositional content, whereas not at issue content is associated with expressive content. So for focus, theory would assume there is one QED per focus constituent, but instead in our corpus we find no one-to-one relationship. The primary reason being enumerations. So we have distinct information units each a focus constituent enumerated to answer a common QD, right? That's the primary reason. So you have multiple focus constituents, which are all semantically distinct and still associated with one QD. So in the table you can see two reviews of two vehicles, an Audi and a Ford. Notice that the number of foci in both texts is higher than the number of QDs. Another reason why there are more foci than QDs is split focus, also called discontinuous focus, where for instance a subordinate clause splits a focus constituent into two parts. We can also look at focus markers, such as German überhaupt, as a specific example of how useful the corpus is. There's an established classification of different uses of this focus marker from König 1983, who distinguishes 4 different classes. So there's a generalization use, there's an extensional statement in a downward entailing context type use, there's a presuppositional use with negation, and also use that expresses sudden inspiration. Then there's another approach by Rojas Esponda, 2014, which takes the 4 classes by König and adds a 5th class. But for Rojas Espondas, it's important to distinguish between focused and unfocused uses. So there's 2 unfocused uses and 3 focused uses. And in the examples you see in 2a through c, you see 3 examples of a focused use of überhaupt, specifically that 5th class that Rojas Espondas added. The examples in 2 are all of the occurrences of überhaupt in the QED Gen corpus. We got generally the ionic is very progressive, and generally the raptor looks like an SUV on the inside, where überhaupt translates to English generally. We also have nevertheless, these prices are achievable if you can even say that in this price range. Here, überhaupt is closer to English even, and in the last example, in the front, there are no complaints at all. Überhaupt is translated to at all. Rojas Esponda's 5th class is characterized by the use of focused überhaupt with a universal quantifier or a scalar predicate. Examples 2a and b include a scalar predicate being progressive and appearing like something respectively. But the adverb überhaupt has been excluded from the focus by the annotator so that the annotated data partially fit into the proposed classification. Rojas Espondas explains the various uses of überhaupt by the attempt of the speaker to resolve all sub-QEDs of a presumed superordinate QED by generalizing over the current propositional content. Hence, in our annotated data, we would expect that überhaupt belongs to a focus, and its function is to signal the answer to a more general QED than the current one. The data in our corpus corroborates Rojas Esponda's view. Überhaupt belongs to the focus constituent, meaning it was annotated as being inside the focus, plus it signals an answer to a super QED, and this is where the QED annotation is quite helpful. Non-additioness is another area where this corpus is beneficial. It's the first attempt to annotate non-additioness. At issue content is associated with the main point of a proposition or assertion, whereas non-at issue content is in some sense secondary to that point. There's many different linguistic expressions that have been associated with non-at issue content and this distinction. The one we want to focus on in this poster are relative clauses because of the established distinction between restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses. So a very common approach to this is to assume that the kind of topic restriction that happens in restrictive relative clauses, compare for instance Potts 2005, also means that restrictive relative clauses are potentially at issue, whereas non-restrictives are not at issue. Then there's more nuanced approaches, like for instance Koev 2013, who also takes into consideration where within the metric sentence the relative clause occurs. So when a non-restrictive relative clause appears sentence final, it can, according to Koev, be at issue. but not when it appears in the middle of a sentence because of anaphoric accessibility. And there's a completely different approach by Roberts and Simons and colleagues, 2009, 2010, where non-restrictive relative clauses are at issue when they are relevant to the QED of their metrics clause. So here's an example of a non-restrictive relative clause. Though the 400 horsepower engine does not lack ambition, and with tires which feel like they are glued to the asphalt, the acceleration hits abruptly like a prize fighter's fists. We can see that the expression in the non-restrictive relative clause is relevant to the QED of the metrics clause. This QED is annotated as "what is good about the kickdown," which names two advantages of the car, namely 1, the 400 horsepower engine, and 2, the tires with good grip. At first glance, the relative clause seems to give a reason why the tires are good, which could be analyzed through a sub-QED. However, notice that the author also could have used an adjective such as good to describe the tires, or even stronger superlatives such as excellent. And world knowledge would tell us that good tires in consumer-level cars usually means that the tires have good grip, which is exactly what the idiomatic reading of the German expression wie Patex am Asphalt kleben. Patex is a brand of glue, so that's where you get glued to the asphalt in the relative clause. Right? So we see in example 3 that it is an example of a non-restrictive supplying an answer to the QED of the metrics clause, which is contextually entailed. In other cases of the corpus, we find sub-QEDs for the non-restrictives with an answer relevant to the QED of the metrics clause. We find a clear trend towards the discourse relation between non-restrictive and metrics clause being either explanation or evidence, two relations with high relevance. Recall Robert Simons and colleagues' definition of additionist centers around relevance. Contrary to the view by Potts, Koev, and the like, we thus conclude that, firstly, sentence medial non-restrictive relative clauses can be at issue, in the sense of Simons et altera. And 2, when they are at issue, it is because they simply supply an explanation for an argument made in the main clause, or they supply evidence for an evaluation made in the main clause. What we can tell from the corpus in general, see the data in the table, is that non-restrictive relative clauses can be at issue, contra, for instance, Potts. So that general point that restrictiveness of relative clauses directly translates to at issueness is not true. In fact, we find the opposite. There are more at issue non-restrictive relative clauses, 52 times in the table, than there are at issue restrictive relative clauses, only 17 times. Secondly, relative clauses are predominantly at issue, regardless of whether they are restrictive or non-restrictive. See in the table the ratio of not at issue to at issue is 1 to 17 and 1 to 52 respectively. Thirdly, while at issue non-restrictives have a tendency to appear sentence final 43 out of 52 times, sentence medial non-restrictives are not, as the grammatical view predicts, always not at issue. Sentence medial non-restrictive relative clauses can be at issue, contra Koev's position. So it doesn't seem to be about sentential position either. Rather, our corpus data is mostly in line with Roberts, Simons, and colleagues. So these are two areas, focus structure and the at issue, not at issue distinction, where we think the QED Gen corpus can give new insight and draw out theoretical distinctions. To sum up, the corpus is XML based. It has hierarchical QED trees to represent various things, among them discourse goals, as well as discourse relations and information structural units. It comes with a graphical annotation tool, CUDA, and the accuracy of annotation has been ensured through an assessment of focus structure as well as through inter-annotator agreement. Thank you for your time. If you would like to know more, please check out our paper and our GitHubs.